What do the Promised Neverland and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, have in common? More than you'd think. My name is Shane, this is my show, and today I'm gushing about my favorite season of anime and how it made me think about being human. Spoilers for Season 1 of The Promised Neverland incoming. If you haven't seen The Promised Neverland yet and want to know if you should, let me just stop you right here so you can go watch it. Season 1 is on Netflix, the dub is actually good, if that's what you're into, it's beautifully animated, and it's the best season of television I've watched in years. Not that there's been much competition. The show is best experienced if you go in blind, so if I've convinced you it's worth watching, go ahead and give it a shot. Come back to this video when you're done. For those who don't care about spoilers, here's the breakdown. Emma, Ray, and Norman are three gifted orphans who live at Grace Field House, an idyllic orphanage in the woods that's surrounded by a mysterious fence. When Emma and Norman uncover the dark truth about what they've been raised for, they realize that they have to risk everything to escape their caretaker and the orphanage. Aw, this is pretty cute. It's a bunch of kids chilling in an actually nice orphanage. You don't see that every day. Aw man, Connie's moving out. I hope they can catch up to her in time. What the fuck? Alright, for those who left, you back? Got a snack? Great. I've got a question for you. Are the children of Grace Fieldhouse slaves? This thought crossed my mind a few weeks ago, and it's a surprisingly complicated question. For one, we gotta define slavery in this context. Slavery is usually understood to be chattel slavery, aka the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other forms of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor also considered to be slavery. The kids of the Promised Neverland are absolutely human beings who are recognized as property, and the show implies that humans have lived in this state for a few generations. So yeah, so far our definition lines up, but there's a particular aspect of their status as property that is distinct from being forced to work without compensation. The kids don't actually do work. They kind of just get to be kids. They live in this wonderful idyllic villa where they have a ton of leisure time, excellent food, and a massive library. Unlike, say, enslaved black people in the Americas, the value of the kids is not produced by their labor, but is instead contained within themselves. They are encouraged to exercise, eat well, and live happy lives. We learn that it's because it makes them taste better, but they don't know that. We have to remember that Grace Field isn't a plantation, it's a farm. Our heroes are definitely considered property in the world of the Promised Neverland. In fact, it would probably be more accurate to call them products. They are luxury goods that are raised and bred to be consumed, who also just so happen to be human children. This is a fantastical circumstance, but it has clear parallels with colonial domination and the transatlantic slave trade, with a notable difference being found in their central mechanics. The houses of the Promised Neverland depend on their slaves living as good a life as possible so as to maximize their value, whereas actual slavery is all about dismantling the humanity of other human beings so as to absorb the value of their labor. Both depend on a lie, a means to break descent at the root. The demons want humans to think that they're free, and plantation owners wanted black people to think that they were slaves. So what happens when a slave learns the truth? In the case of Emma, Ray, Norman, and my boy Frederick Douglass, they break their breakers. If The Promised Neverland is about slaves, then that means we can classify its story as a slave narrative, an account of the life, in whole or part, of a fugitive or former enslaved person that was either written or told by them. As the only stories about and from former slaves during the 19th century, slave narratives were so much more than memoirs. As Professor Williams L. Andrews puts it, as historical documents, slave narratives chronicle the evolution of white supremacy in the South from 18th century slavery through early 20th century segregation and disenfranchisement. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, is easily one of the most famous of these narratives, and heralded the rise of Frederick as both an abolitionist and writer. The success of his narrative, and many of the others published around that time, comes from the fact that their lives are framed as stories about exceptional individuals who shed their circumstances to become something greater. The American dream. This is intentional. As Andrews puts it, the most memorable of these narratives evoke the national myth of the American individual's quest for freedom and for a society based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slave narratives are often mapped onto the story structure of a classic hero's journey, and the villain to Frederick's hero is embodied in his experience with Covey, the slave breaker. Covey and Isabella from the Promised Neverland are two sides of the same coin. Covey is cruel and sadistic, empowered by the fact that he has never been challenged, while Isabella acts as a caring, generous mother until it's time to smother dissent by any means necessary. Isabella and Covey are both figureheads representing the markets and society that they also enforce. Covey is a white supremacist who directly profits, while Isabella recognizes herself as a commodity as well as her wards and willingly feeds her own people to monsters to ensure her own comfort. Covey and Isabella are there to break slaves, with a whip and caress, respectively. As such, the conflict with these breakers is the turning point of Frederick and the kids' slave narratives. Covey is everything a young Augustus Bailey, who will eventually become Frederick Douglass, defines himself against. A white farmer who doesn't own slaves of his own, Covey is hired to break the will of slaves on other plantations in return for leasing their labor for his own farm. 16-year-old Douglas detests his hypocrisy, a married man who assaults enslaved black women and tortures other enslaved subjects at his leisure. For 6 brutal months, Covey tortures Douglas to his breaking point. Unlike Covey, Isabella is herself a slave to the demons, albeit one with knowledge of her condition. The show heavily implies that she's such a good mom because she actually cares for her wards in her own sick, twisted way. She justifies her abuse as a kind of love, in the same way that slave masters held a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other. Like our heroes, she also once dreamed of the world beyond the wall, but instead of imagining her escape, she instead accepts the opportunity to join the institution that treats her like cattle at the expense of every other human being that she will ever know. How the Promised Neverland deals with motherhood is complex enough to fill an entirely different video, but I just wanted to highlight it here to point out that Isabella is so terrifying because her belief in the permanence of the status quo is as intense as Emma's belief that she and the other children of Gracefield can all escape together.
絶望に苦しまずに済む一番の方法は諦めることよ。抗うから辛い。受け入れるの。楽になれるわ。簡単よ。
コニーで終わりにしたいの。もう誰もあんな姿にしたくない。ないなら作ろうよ外に。人間の生きる場所。変えようよ世界。
Both of these breakers are defeated by having their belief in the expectations of the master-slave dynamic irrevocably shattered. Those that they abuse rebuke their dehumanization and ultimately escape because they are so underestimated. It's significant that both antagonists lose because they believe that our heroes are already broken. Douglas confessed that he was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed, the cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. Emma is near comatose for months after one of her best friends and co-conspirators is sent to his death, but the fire of rebellion, of humanity, keeps burning. In the climax of his narrative, Frederick snaps and beats the absolute dog shit out of Covey, just mollywops him to the moon and back for 2 hours straight. And while Douglas remained a slave for a few years after this fateful battle, Covey never whipped him again. In the aftermath of their brawl, Frederick had claimed his humanity in his own hands. He identified this moment as the spiritual end of his enslavement. You have seen how a man was made a slave. you shall see how a slave was made a man. That line is absolutely fire. Frederick's life would have been a dope anime. Please don't actually make this, I'm joking, that would be super fucking blasphemous. Emma's final escape plan is also the culmination of her reclaiming her humanity. She spends the entire arc being told that the best plan for escape is to escape with a small group. And while she is clearly naive, I think her naivete is the expression of a deep love for her fellow human beings. It's also where the tension between the tropes of shonen anime and the fugitive slave story is most felt. Her unflinching faith that they can all escape is pointed out as untenable several times, but she's the protagonist, so it works out. It helps that Emma's effort to make the impossible possible does have some lasting consequences. She upends Ray's belief that resistance requires martyrdom by refusing to let him sacrifice himself so that she can escape. And she rejects Isabella's selfishness by trusting the other kids with the truth of their situation. Emma refuses to let her condition degrade her faith in humanity, and her faith revives her humanity and helps her revolution succeed. Everyone can escape this prison, because a better world is possible when you dare to fight for it. This connection to slave narrative obviously isn't one-to-one. The Promised Neverland stakes are fantastical at its core, where the villains are literal baby-eating monsters and our heroes are a trio of baby geniuses. The heightened premise means that the series' connection to race is not immediately self-evident, and I think there are other viable readings of the house system as a critique of social ills. And as a black anime fan, I can say from personal experience that anime and race issues have a troubled history, to say the least.
Hey, what the fuck? You got a fucking problem? I'll pound the living shit out of you, you dumbass freaky tourist.
Even in this show. But I think season 1 of The Promised Neverland resonates with the tradition of slave narrative in a way that's worth considering. Like many slave narratives, it's a beautifully told story about faith, rebellion, and resisting the commodification of oneself. I'm giving it 4 slaps out of a bop. A bop is 5 slaps, in case you didn't know. Did you like this video? You should like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps a lot and I really appreciate it. What do you guys think? Is The Promised Neverland a slave narrative? Does that make the autobiography of Malcolm X a light novel? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.